26 was told not to comfort my Amish wife after our wedding. I obeyed the night I married Rebecca Lapp. I was 22 years old, and I had never once held her while she cried. Not because I didn't want to, because 3 hours before the ceremony, my father pulled me into the barn, set his hand on my shoulder, and told me the one rule I was to follow above all others. When your wife weeps, he said, you do not go to her, you do not touch her, you do not ask why. A husband who comforts a woman's tears teaches her that tears have power. He squeezed my shoulder once and walked back toward the house, and I stood there in the smell of hay and horse sweat, watching him go, wondering why he looked relieved. My name is Joseph. I live now in a small rented house about 40 minutes outside the community where I was raised. I'm 51. Rebecca is 49. We are still married, though for a long stretch of years, that word meant something closer to occupation than partnership. I'm telling this because my oldest son is engaged, and last week he asked me what advice my father gave me before my wedding. I couldn't answer him. I just looked at my hands, and that silence, that old familiar silence, told me it was time to say out loud what I have carried quietly for almost 30 years. I grew up in a district in northern Indiana, one of the stricter settlements in the area. Our bishop was a man named Eli Troyer. He had led the congregation since before I was born, and in our household, his word carried the same weight as Scripture. Sometimes more, because Scripture required interpretation, and Bishop Troyer did not. He spoke plainly, he expected obedience plainly, and my father Abram was his closest ally in the community, not by title but by temperament. My father believed that a well-ordered home was the foundation of a well-ordered church, and a well-ordered home began with one principle: the husband does not bend. I was the youngest of 4 sons. My brothers had all married by the time I began courting Rebecca. Each of them, I later learned, received the same instruction from our father. Each of them obeyed. I did not know this at the time. I thought the instruction was specific to me, something my father saw in me that worried him, some softness, some tendency toward tenderness that he wanted to correct before it took root in my marriage. Rebecca and I had courted for nearly a year. She was quiet and careful with her words, but she had a way of watching things, birds, children, the way light moved across a table, that made me feel the world was more detailed than I had been noticing. I loved her. I say that plainly because I want you to understand that what followed did not come from indifference. It came from the opposite. I loved her so much that I was terrified of failing her, and in my community, failure meant disobedience, and disobedience meant you had placed your own feelings above the structure God had built for your family. The wedding was in November. Nearly 300 people. Rebecca wore a new blue dress her mother had sewn, and during the ceremony she kept her eyes down, the way she'd been taught. But once, just once, she glanced sideways at me, and the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like a small private signal meant only for me. I held that look inside my chest for the rest of the day. I thought it meant we understood each other without language. I thought it meant we would be fine. That evening, after the last of the guests had gone, and her parents had left us alone in the small house the community had prepared, Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. She pressed her hands together in her lap, and tears ran down her face in 2 straight lines, and her shoulders shook once, then stopped, then shook again. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask for anything. I stood near the doorway. My father's voice was so clear inside my head it might as well have been in the room. A husband who comforts a woman's tears teaches her that tears have power. I watched my wife cry on what should have been the most joyful night of our life together, and I did nothing. I walked to the other side of the room, removed my boots, and began preparing for bed as though the sound she was making was no different from wind against the window. She stopped after a few minutes. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood, adjusted her dress, and began folding things that didn't need folding. Neither of us spoke, and I told myself this was correct, that my father had been married for 36 years, and he understood what I did not, that Rebecca would be stronger for this, that I was protecting the order of our home. The first weeks of marriage were quiet in a way I mistook for peace. Rebecca cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden. She spoke to me gently and directly, and she did not cry again, at least not where I could see. I took this as proof that my father's instruction had worked. The tears on the wedding night had been nerves, I decided, adjustment, and by not responding, I had shown her that our home would be steady. My father visited often during those first months, always unannounced. He would sit at our table, drink coffee, and observe. He watched how Rebecca served. He watched whether she spoke before I did. He watched whether she touched me casually, a hand on the arm, a brush against my shoulder, or whether she maintained the measured distance he considered appropriate. After each visit, he would walk with me to the fence line and offer a small correction. "She reached for your hand at the table," or "She interrupted when you were speaking to me," or "She looked up too quickly when you entered the room." I began repeating these observations to Rebecca, not cruelly, quietly. I would say, "My father noticed you reached for my hand at the table. It would be better if you waited." And Rebecca would nod. She would say, "I understand." And the next time, she would not reach. She would not interrupt. She would not look up too quickly. Each correction was small. Each one was easy to justify. But I see now that each one removed something, not a rule violation, but a reflex, an instinct, a small natural motion of affection that she had to teach herself to suppress. By our first anniversary, Rebecca no longer reached for me at all. I told myself this was maturity, that we had built a disciplined home. Bishop Troyer praised us publicly during a Sunday gathering, calling our household an example of right order. My father sat in the back row and nodded. I felt proud. I felt like I had passed a test I had been preparing for my entire life. The following spring, Rebecca became pregnant. I expected this to bring warmth back into the house, and in some ways it did. She hummed while she worked. She rested her hand on her stomach absently, the way women do when they are thinking about the life inside them. But the pregnancy was difficult. She was sick often and tired, and one evening I came inside to find her sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, her face pale and wet. She was crying, the same quiet, straight-line tears I had seen on our wedding night. I stood in the doorway. I felt the pull in my chest, the instinct to kneel beside her, to put my hand on her back, to ask what was wrong. And then I heard my father's voice. I crossed the kitchen, filled a glass of water, set it on the counter beside her, and walked outside. I stood on the porch and listened to the silence that followed. When I came back inside 20 minutes later, the glass was untouched, and Rebecca was upstairs. That night in bed, she lay with her back to me and said, very quietly, "I wasn't crying because I'm weak, Joseph." I didn't answer. After a while, she said, "I was crying because I'm frightened." I stared at the ceiling. I wanted to roll toward her. I wanted to say something that would close the distance between us. Instead, I said, "Fear passes. Rest now." Our son was born in December, healthy, loud, red-faced. Rebecca held him against her chest and wept openly for the first time since our wedding night, and I stood beside the bed and watched her cry with joy and exhaustion, and I did not touch her, and I did not say that I was proud of her, and I did not understand why the midwife looked at me the way she did when she left the room. Over the next 2 years, things settled into a pattern. Rebecca raised our son. I worked. My father visited. The corrections continued, though they became less frequent. Not because my father had less to say, but because Rebecca had learned. She anticipated what would be noticed. She had become fluent in the language of restraint. She no longer made mistakes because she no longer acted without first calculating whether the action would be observed and measured. I want to be honest about something. I did not feel like a cruel man. I felt like a responsible one. Every decision I made was consistent with what I had been taught by the 2 men I trusted most, my father and my bishop. Every correction was delivered calmly. I never raised my voice. I never raised my hand. I never locked a door or withheld food or made a threat. And because the harm had no sharp edges, I could not see it. It moved like water, slow and constant, reshaping the ground so gradually that neither of us noticed the erosion until the landscape was unrecognizable. The moment that began to change my understanding came when our son was 3. I was passing the bedroom and heard Rebecca singing to him, a lullaby, something her mother had taught her. And as I listened, I realized I had never heard her sing before, not once in nearly 5 years of marriage. She sang only when she believed I was outside. I stood in the hallway and listened to my wife's voice, and it was beautiful, and it was something she had hidden from me. And for the first time, I asked myself why a woman would hide something beautiful from her own husband. I did not have the courage to answer that question immediately, but it stayed with me. It followed me to the barn and to the fields and to Sunday service. It sat beside me at the table while Rebecca served food with steady hands and a face that gave away nothing. A few weeks later, I visited my brother Thomas. He was the second oldest, married 12 years by then. His wife Martha moved through their home the same way Rebecca moved through ours. Efficient, composed, careful, and I noticed something I had never noticed before. When Thomas entered the room, Martha's shoulders tightened. It lasted only a fraction of a second. Then she adjusted, softened her posture, and continued what she was doing. It was so practiced it was nearly invisible. But I recognized it. I recognized it because I had seen Rebecca do the same thing 1,000 times. I watched Thomas interact with Martha the way my father had taught us. Measured, steady, no unnecessary tenderness. And Martha responded with the same calibrated obedience Rebecca had learned. I looked at my brother's marriage and saw my own, and for the first time I did not see order. I saw two people performing a version of closeness that had been stripped of every instinct that made closeness real. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and traced the history backward. Every correction, every suppressed gesture, every tear I had refused to acknowledge. I thought about Rebecca on our wedding night, 20 years old, sitting on the edge of a bed in a house she had never slept in, married to a man she loved, crying softly, and her husband standing by the door, doing nothing, because his father told him not to. I began making small changes. I did not announce them. I did not explain. One morning I poured Rebecca's coffee before she reached the pot. She looked at me with an expression I could not read. Not gratitude, not suspicion, something between recognition and disbelief, as though a wall she had accepted as permanent had developed a crack. Few days later, I asked her about the lullaby. She froze. Then she said, "You heard that?" I nodded. She looked down at her hands and said, "My mother sang it to me when I was small." I said, "It was beautiful." She did not respond, but that evening she hummed it while washing dishes, and she did not stop when I entered the room. These changes were invisible to anyone outside our home, but my father noticed. On his next visit, he watched me pass Rebecca a dish directly instead of setting it on the table between us. Afterward, at the fence line, he said, "You are becoming familiar." I said, "She is my wife." He said, "That is exactly why you must not." He looked at me with an expression I had seen my entire life, certainty so complete it left no room for question. But for the first time, I did not feel corrected. I felt something closer to grief, because I realized my father was not teaching me strength. He was passing down his own deprivation and calling it wisdom. I went to Bishop Troyer. I did not frame it as rebellion. I asked a careful question. Is it wrong for a husband to comfort his wife when she is distressed? The bishop studied me for a long time. Then he said, "A woman who is comforted learns to create distress. A woman who is not comforted learns to overcome it. You are not withholding comfort, Joseph. You are building her." He said it with kindness. He said it as though he were giving me a gift. And I sat in his kitchen and understood that this man, whom I had trusted since childhood, believed that love and deprivation were the same thing. I did not confront my father. I did not confront the bishop. I simply stopped obeying. When Rebecca cried over a letter from her sister, over exhaustion, over the weight of a day that had taken more than she had, I went to her. I sat beside her. Sometimes I put my hand on her back. Sometimes I said nothing at all. I was just there, present in the room, while she felt what she felt, and I did not leave. The first time I did this, she flinched. She physically pulled away from my hand, as though my touch was a trick or a test. That flinch, that small, instinctive withdrawal, was the moment I understood the full cost of what I had done. I had not built a disciplined home. I had taught my wife that my presence during her pain was something to fear. It took months before she stopped flinching. It took longer before she leaned into me. And there was one evening, I remember it exactly, because our son was asleep and the house was quiet and the lantern was low, when Rebecca put her head against my shoulder and cried, and I held her, and she said, "I thought you didn't love me. For years, Joseph. I thought you married me out of duty, and I was alone." My father stopped visiting when he realized I had changed. He never said why. He simply came less often, then not at all. We were not shunned. My disobedience was too private, too domestic, too invisible for formal discipline. But the distance was real. My brothers continued as they had been taught. Their wives continued as they had learned. My family became the quiet exception, the household that had drifted without cause anyone would name aloud. I was told not to comfort my wife after our wedding. I obeyed. I obeyed for 5 years, and in those 5 years I taught the woman I loved that she was alone inside her own marriage, that her grief was a test, that her tears were a failure, that reaching for her husband was a mistake she needed to correct. I have spent the decades since trying to undo what those 5 years built. Some of it has healed. Rebecca sings openly now. She reaches for my hand at the table. She cries in front of me without apology. But there are moments, still, even now, when something painful happens and I see her glance at me first, quickly, checking, making sure it is safe, and that glance is the cost. That fraction of a second calculation she still performs, 26 years after I stopped obeying, is the scar my obedience left on her. Last week my son asked me what advice my father gave me before my wedding. I looked at him, 23 years old, in love with a kind woman, nervous and hopeful the way I was once nervous and hopeful, and I said, "When your wife cries, stay in the room. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to say anything. Just be there. Let her know that her pain doesn't make you leave." He nodded. He didn't ask why my voice broke. Rebecca was in the kitchen. She heard me through the open window. That evening, after our son had gone home, she came outside and sat beside me on the porch. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on mine and left it there. And I thought about a 20-year-old girl sitting on the edge of a bed in a house she had never slept in, crying quietly, waiting for a hand that never came. I would give almost anything to go back to that doorway, but I cannot. So I sit on this porch with the woman she became, and I hold her hand, and I do not let go.